Section G, the Nixon Landslide of 1972. So we're still talking about the election of 72. And the election of 72 is definitely going to be focusing around foreign affairs, right? Foreign policy, specifically Vietnam, but the Cold War in general. Well, the Republicans in 72, there's no problem they have with Nixon, so they're going to renominate Nixon for the Republican Party. He had 4 years previously promised to win peace in Vietnam, and although he did not carry through with that promise, nonetheless, the Republicans decided to keep him. 72 in Vietnam, what was going on is that the North Vietnamese got some new tanks from the Soviets, more or less, and they used these tanks to really push through that stalemate. So the North Koreans, not Koreans, the North Vietnamese with these new tanks are really pushing south into South Vietnam, even through the demilitarized zone, that kind of buffer zone, no man's land, if you will, between North and South Vietnam, that is being pushed through. So, in response to this breakthrough of the North Vietnamese, what happens is Nixon orders to start bombing the major cities in North Vietnam, and also puts a blockade on the major harbors in North Vietnam. So there is some drama going down in Vietnam during the 72 election. Okay. On the flip side, the Democrats, they nominate a senator from South Dakota. His name is George McGovern. And George McGovern, his promise is that within 90 days, all of the troops will be pulled out of Vietnam. So definitely an anti-war candidate if there ever was one. What kind of handicapped him a little bit within his party was the fact that he was fairly liberal when it comes to civil rights. So that alienated a lot of those Southern Democrats, those kind of like Dixiecrats who aren't huge fans of civil rights. So that was kind of a handicap that Senator McGovern had. And also his running mate, his VP candidate, his name is Senator Thomas Eagleton, revealed that he had received some psychiatric care that had included electroshock therapy. So a lot of Americans not a huge fan of having someone running that had electroshock therapy. So really, the Democrats didn't really have a very strong candidate running, shall we say. So that clears the way for Nixon. Nixon promised in this election that he would wind down this democratic war. He'd bring the troops from Nixon had said during his first term, I should make this clear, during his first term, he said that he helped to wind down. He's winding down the war. He reduced the troops from 540,000 American troops to 30,000 American troops. And then plus right before the war, like 12 days, right before the election, like 12 days before the election, Kissinger, right, Secretary of State, declared that peace was at hand, that it was only going to be a matter of days before they came up with a peace compromise. So this is just looking really good for Nixon, right? So what happened is Nixon did win in a landslide, as the title gave away, right? The Nixon Landslide of 72. He got 520 electoral votes to only 17 for McGovern. McGovern was really counting on kind of like the youth vote, but only about half of those able to vote, half of those 18 to 21, those young folks, were actually even registered to vote. All right. However, after Nixon wins, Kissinger had said peace was at hand, but however, peace kind of fluttered away, right? North Korea left the negotiation table, so to speak. So what Nixon does is he steps it up in Vietnam. He has 2 weeks of this just fierce bombing of North Vietnam to try to get them back to the conference table. So finally, after 3 months, not in the next couple of days, but after 3 months, finally a ceasefire is negotiated in January of 73. And this is called the Treaty of Paris. Of course, it was signed in Paris. There's a lot of Treaty of Parises. If you ever have a question like what was the treaty called, just say it's the Treaty of Paris. It's probably right. Anyway, so there was a ceasefire signed. And yes, we say it's a ceasefire, so it's kind of like no one wins, no one loses. But really what it was a thinly veiled attempt to hide the fact it was an American retreat, right? This is Americans getting out of Vietnam. Part of the ceasefire, you have to understand that North Vietnam, they had broken through that line. So North Vietnam still controlled about 30% of the South Vietnamese territory. As a part of the peace, the North Vietnamese were allowed to keep 145,000 troops in South Vietnam. So more or less, the ceasefire was Americans were going to leave. Okay. Section H, the secret bombing of Cambodia and the War Powers Act. So, although Nixon had promised to stop bombing Cambodia, once again, Cambodia is that neutral country just west of Vietnam that the North Vietnamese were using as a springboard to launch attacks into South Vietnam. Nonetheless, Nixon continued to bomb Cambodia. Okay. And the worst thing is when this broke that he'd been secretly bombing Cambodia, that whole time he had been saying, no, I'm upholding Cambodia's right to neutrality. So it was kind of this big scandal, right? He's saying one thing, doing another thing. Okay. Yes, and even after the ceasefire in 73 was signed, Nixon continued to bomb Cambodia because he was hoping that he would help bring about a more democratic government. He thought if he kept bombing Cambodia, that those communists wouldn't have such a stronghold in Cambodia, so maybe a more conservative government might happen there. However, what this bombing really does is it brings about a dictator in Cambodia. Pol Pot, P-O-L-P-O-T. Pol Pot is this tyrant that ends up taking power in Cambodia. He's just vicious. He ends up killing about 2 million of his own people. So it's not a good thing happening in Cambodia. Okay, so the secret bombing of Cambodia, check. Okay, now we're going to go to the War Powers Act. Okay, so reviewing, remember Johnson had gotten past the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And remember that was kind of like a blank check allowing Johnson, or the president, I should say, to do whatever he needed to do in Vietnam. Johnson describes it as, like grandma's nightgown, right? It covers everything. So because of that Gulf of Tonkin resolution, they had a lot of power. Johnson, and then after Johnson, Nixon. So Congress was over this. Congress wants to regain that power because after all, in the Constitution, it's Congress who gets to declare war. So what happens is Congress passes over, of course, Nixon's veto, the War Powers Act, and this is in November of 73. And it requires the president to report to Congress within 48 hours or within 2 days anytime he sends troops anywhere. Okay? And then Congress gets to decide if they're going to approve it or disapprove the movement of troops. So if Congress does not approve the movement of troops, the president has to stop that action within the next 60 days. So it's just more or less War Powers Act is Congress trying to get some of that power back from the president, making the president more accountable for where he's sending troops and allowing Congress to, say no. Okay. And really, this War Power Act ushers in just kind of a growing trend of this new isolationism. Vietnam was a hot mess, right? It riled up Americans here. A lot of Americans died. So it's more of this idea of isolationism, but more of like caution and restraint in foreign affairs, kind of that is brought about after the mess of Vietnam. All right, Section I, Section I, the Arab Oil Embargo and the Energy Crisis. So this section, just so you know, is going to start talking about something called the Yom Kippur War. Okay, just so you know, this is where it's leading up to the Yom Kippur War. Okay, October of 73, the Middle East kind of erupts. Drama, okay, as the Middle East does from time to time. So what's happening again, this is another kind of offshoot of the Cold War. It's going to be the Soviets and the United States fighting through kind of intermediaries. Let's talk about it. Okay, so the Syrians and the Egyptians, mostly the Egyptians, right? So we'll just say the Egyptians are being backed once again by Soviets, so getting weapons, that sort of thing from the Soviets. The Egyptians attack again Israel, okay? And Egyptians are trying to get back that land they had lost during the 6 Days War. So some of the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, that sort of thing. So Egypt wants back their territory. So Egypt and Syria, backed by the Soviets, are attacking Israel. Well, the United States is not going to just let that one slide. So the United States starts to heavily aid Israel. So this is just kind of another offshoot of the Cold War, right? The Soviets versus the United States. Where am I at? Okay. And this is it's a crisis. The United States doesn't want to go to nuclear war with the Soviets, but it's definitely on the table. So we're scared that Egypt is not going to just want back the territory they lost from Israel, but they're afraid that we're going to we might lose control of the Suez Canal, okay? And the Suez Canal, once again, super important because that's how we get our oil from the Arab Peninsula to, Europe and America for that instance. So anyway, we're helping out Israel to the tune of about $2 billion worth of war materials. And eventually it's resolved through diplomatic means. The United States kind of steps up their diplomatic measures and it brings kind of this uneasy ceasefire. Once again, this is the Yom Kippur War. The effects is probably more important than what actually happened. The effects is this really, really ticks off OPEC. Remember OPEC? And so OPEC announces an oil embargo which will last about 5 months against the United States and some other European countries that had helped out Israel in this Yom Kippur War. And of course they further cut their oil production, and because they decrease the supply of oil and that demand is going to be staying constant, that means the price of oil is going to go through the roof. And remember, we're talking about oil, we're talking about cars, but also that's like your heater. That's how you stay warm in the winter. And this was a particularly harsh winter within the United States. So oil prices were just crazy. There were really long lines at the gas stations as well, right? This is kind of an energy crisis, we'll call it, during this oil embargo, which happens kind of in effect because we helped Israel in the Yom Kippur War. We're getting real fancy today. Nonetheless, what happens, energy crisis in America, because of that, they approved the Alaskan pipeline. The national speed limit is decreased to 55 miles an hour because the slower you go, the more oil energy efficient your car is. And this is really when the era of cheap oil is officially ended. Remember, after World War II, oil had been so inexpensive and Americans thought that was going to last forever. Well, after this Yom Kippur War, after this energy crisis, we start to realize oil is never going to be that cheap ever again. Okay, so 5 months later, after the oil embargo actually ends, the price of oil is quadrupled, so like times 4 its normal cost. To help respond to kind of OPEC's power, the United States sets up the International Energy Agency in 1974 as kind of, like I said, a counterweight to OPEC, and slowly the U.S. is recovering, but it's not fun to feel so dependent on nations overseas. All right, Section J, Watergate and the unmaking of a president. I wonder which president they're referring to. Oh, yes, they're referring to Nixon. Remember, Nixon is a Republican. He is a tried and true Republican. But nonetheless, what happens is that there are 5 people who were caught bugging the office of the Democratic Party's headquarters, okay? So the Democratic Party's headquarters was in this kind of apartment/office complex called the Watergate. And these 5 people were found out to be working who were bugging the office, right? Bugging it is like kind of putting microphones in there so you can hear what's going on. So 5 people were caught bugging this office in the Watergate. And these 5 people who were caught worked for the Republican Committee to re-elect the president, sometimes abbreviated CREEP. How appropriate. So this Watergate scandal breaks. At first, Nixon denies any knowledge of it, any connection to it. After all, he's not like the head of the committee to re-elect the president. He just kind of benefits from it. So at first, Nixon's like, I don't know what this is. Like, I'm not connected to it. Like, shame on them. Okay. So what happens is then they start this kind of just general investigation of Nixon's administration. And this break-in in the Democratic headquarters is just one of many kind of dirty tricks the Nixon administration is found to have used. Other things that would happen is they would forge documents that would help discredit their Democratic opponents. Nixon had used the IRS, right, the tax people, to kind of harass his enemies. A lot of different things, FBI, CIA, all of that was used to really go after Nixon's enemies, and all these things start coming to light. To make matters worse, Nixon's VP, right, Agnew, actually resigns, connected with a separate scandal. Agnew had been governor of Maryland, and when he was governor of Maryland, he was found to have been taking some bribes from this construction company. So this construction company was bribing him to use their services, whatever, in Maryland. So Agnew resigns. So in this process, the 25th Amendment had been passed, and according to the 25th Amendment, that gives the president power to replace his VP if his VP resigns. So Nixon replaces Agnew with Gerald Ford, a senator from Michigan. That'll become important in just a little bit. So in the midst of this, goodbye Vice President Agnew, hello new appointee Gerald Ford. Okay, let's see where we are. Okay, so what happens is this the Senate committee that was like investigating this mess conducted widely televised hearings about Watergate and other scandals. And of course, like I said, Nixon denies any knowledge or connection to this at all. However, a lot of Nixon's former employees will get up on the stand and accuse him of knowing all about this, of being very much involved. And one of the aides actually says, you know what, Nixon tapes every single conversation that happens in the Oval Office. Okay? So then, of course, the Senate committee wants him to hand over the tapes, right? Nixon, if you are innocent, why not just give us the tapes? Nixon says, no, I'm not going to give you the tapes. And he says, you know, he has executive privilege. This is kind of a phrase he kind of makes up. This is not like a constitutional idea. He just says, no, I have executive privilege. I don't have to give you anything. Well, the Supreme Court's like, well, I'm sorry, Nixon. Executive privilege, that's not really a thing. You have to hand over the tapes. So Nixon hands over the tapes. The tapes make it super clear that he definitely was involved in the break-in, but also in trying to cover it up afterwards. And so, you know, he's kind of caught red-handed. All right. So after this kind of revelation of the tapes, the House Judiciary Committee, the committee that would impeach the president, starts drawing up the impeachment papers, right? It is very clear that if Nixon does not resign, he is definitely going to be kicked out, right? He's definitely going to be impeached. So his advisors say, you know what, Nixon, you really do just need to resign, take your losses and go. And that's exactly what Nixon does. August 8th of 74, he resigns on TV. And instead of people singing the song, Hail to the Chief, Hail to the Chief, blah, 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 they say, Jail to the Chief. Send him away, he's a crook. All right. But, you know, it showed, hey, founding fathers, you knew what was going on. Look, we kicked out a president without massive chaos. Democracy. All right, Section K, the first unelected president. Okay. First unelected president, of course, is referring to our friend Jerry. We'll just call him Jerry Ford. Okay. The thing was, Ford, of course, he had been appointed vice president. He had never been elected vice president. He was appointed by Nixon, and then he was approved by Congress. So poor Ford was really, he had people just kind of thought he was really just like this former college football player who was really dim-witted. Was it Johnson that said? Yeah, Johnson said, former President Johnson accused Ford of not being able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So people really had this image of Ford as this kind of like knuckle-headed ex-football player, which was not, of course, a fair presentation of his abilities, because he does do some important stuff. In foreign affairs, he helps get passed or helps along something called the Helsinki Accords. The Helsinki Accords was once again this kind of melting of the Cold War, kind of the détente policy, trying to get better relationship with the Soviets. However, these accords, what happened is the United States more or less said, hey, Soviet Union, we're going to keep selling you grain. We're going to share with you some of our technological advances, that sort of thing. So kind of, trying to form a better relationship here. Although critics highly criticized Ford because it seemed a lot like a one-way relationship. We were giving grain, we were giving our technology to the Soviets, but the Soviets weren't giving us anything. And the Soviets continued to just have a lot of kind of human rights violations going on. So the Helsinki Accords, while it was this period of, you could say it was like a détente period, a period of kind of melting of the Cold War a little bit, it didn't last long because it was really kind of one-sided. Okay, section L, defeat in Vietnam. Let's talk about it. Okay, so after Americans withdrew from Vietnam, remember we signed that ceasefire, the Treaty of Paris. So after that was signed, kind of all hell broke loose a little bit. So now that the United States was pulling out of this war, it was just a matter of time before those communist North Vietnamese just crushed the South Vietnamese. So what happened is the North Vietnamese were so aggressive at kind of invading the South that we had to evacuate our troops quickly. Right, we had to send in helicopters to evacuate our troops. Also, we evacuated about 140,000 South Vietnamese who were so highly connected with America that had we left them behind, it would kind of been a death sentence for them because the North Vietnamese would definitely have targeted them. So there was about 140,000 South Vietnamese kind of American helpers that we evacuated as well. In the long run, there'll be about 500,000 South Vietnamese that will immigrate to the United States due to this war. But nonetheless, this huge war kind of just ended with a whimper. We evacuated our troops. North Vietnam just came in and just kind of crushed South Vietnam. Let's see. In the end, it cost us about $118 billion. 56,000 Americans were killed. 300,000 were wounded. And we really had everything to win except for the will, right? We had the resources, we had the strategy, we had the manpower. We just didn't have the support internationally or even in the United States. So kind of a sad chapter ends there in Vietnam. Other effects, we lost face internationally. It really hurt us economically. We could have invested that money in a lot different matter, in a different matter. And just kind of losing confidence in our military. We had lost, Okay, with that is enough for this video. We're done.